Okay, welcome everybody to the CrySP speaker series on privacy. This is our first time doing the speaker series in the new COVID era online kind of world, and it's a little bit of an experiment, so hopefully it all goes well. This is our 10th year of the CrySP speaker series on privacy. As Jen mentioned in the pre-show a few minutes ago, you can go to the CrySP Speaker Series webpage and see videos of many past years of talks, and those are available both from our webpage and also on our YouTube channel. We're very glad to have Safiya Noble, and to introduce her, my colleague and co-instructor in our Surveillance and Privacy Interdisciplinary course, Professor Jen Whitson, will give the introduction.
Hi all, thanks for joining us today. I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Safiya Noble. She's had past lives as a UX designer, a sociologist, she's worked in PR and marketing, and her current life includes being a parent and a faculty member at UCLA. She's the co-founder and co-director of UCLA's Center for Critical Internet Inquiry with Sarah T. Roberts. Just a note, Sarah T. Roberts is a past CrySP speaker, and you can check out her talk on commercial content moderation on the site. Their work together looks at the social impact of digital tech, including AI, predictive tech, internet platforms, and the related economics, business practices, and policies. And they specifically, their work looks at the impact on workers and underrepresented and vulnerable communities. Dr. Noble is the author of Algorithms of Oppression, which is recognized by Bustle magazine as one of the 10 books about race to read instead of asking a person of color to explain things to you. And it was also featured in the New York Public Library's Best Books for Adults in 2018. The versions currently in development are the graphic novel version and the instructor's guide. Safiya's work is very much academic, but it is also outside of the ivory tower. She's had a really, really wide influence, and you can see that in her countless book reviews, YouTube talks, and edited collections, as well as on September 25th, she was named one of 25 members of the Real Facebook Oversight Board, an independent monitoring group over Facebook. So a shadow cabinet, if you will, of Facebook critics to hold them accountable. And these books and projects are just the tip of the iceberg. Check out her website, her Twitter, YouTube videos to see much more of her work. And looking at her CV, I was just struck by how extra she is. Her grad supervision, her journal editorial boards, her conference and manuscript reviewing, advisory board membership, mentorship, knowledge translation in literally dozens and dozens and dozens of talks each and every year just are completely exhausting and inspiring. So I'd like you to listen to Dr. Noble's talk and think about what we need to do here at Waterloo and in our classes and in our writing and in our teaching to support and make it easier for work like hers to challenge and change our internet and challenge and change our ivory tower. So without further ado, please put a clap in the chat for Dr. Noble. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Whitson and Professor Goldberg. This is just such a thrill for me to get to be here with you. And Jen, that might be the very best intro anyone has ever given. So I just want to say thank you so much for, just the thoughtful way in which the two of you engage in your own work with your students and invite me to participate in it. So I'm really thrilled to be here. I wish that I were with you in person. I'm joining you today from Los Angeles. So I'm going to try not to say morning when I know it's your afternoon and that kind of thing. And I just want to give the disclaimer that, like everybody who's working from home, there's going to be, I don't know, doorbells ringing, dogs barking, all the things. So if you'll just bear with me with that, I really appreciate you. So I thought that today, as part of this incredibly distinguished lecture series, that I might share a little bit of my work from the book, Algorithms of Oppression, and then more so think about the future and kind of the work that I've been trying to publish and speak about, and that I'm working on for kind of the future. And so kind of end, maybe in 3 acts, we'll approach kind of what I've been up to, what I'm doing, and what I'm thinking about for the future. I should also say that, our newly established Center for Critical Internet Inquiry at UCLA, it's we call it C2I2, which is like, I guess, as close to R2D2 as you can get, because we're all Gen X and Star Wars'd out. But our work there has really been designed to be a bit of an outpost for people who are interested in studying the internet with kind of a critical power analysis in a variety of different ways. So as Professor Whitson mentioned, my colleague and co-director Sarah Roberts works on commercial content moderation, and the people who do the heaviest, lifted work and some of the most harmful psychologically, neurologically, emotionally. I work on kind of thinking about platforms and the role that they, kind of the outsized role that they play in society, and kind of making new instantiations of harm, discrimination, and oppression. And, when we first started our work, the two of us, when we were graduate students at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, that's how far back we go. It was very difficult. There were no classes like the kinds of classes that you all are taking now. I mean, we had a couple of professors who studied the internet critically, and we, of course, took everything that they offered. I'm thinking of people like Professor Dan Schiller, who's since retired from the University of Illinois, Professor Lisa Nakamura, who has since gone on to an endowed chair at the University of Michigan. But really, there weren't that many people. There wasn't enough a decade ago to, let's say, make an internet studies place or space. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do at UCLA. And I just want to invite you all to follow our work. We're always kind of trying to put out signals, shoot up flares for people who are interested in the kind of work that we're doing and that you are all doing right now in these amazing classes that you're taking around surveillance and privacy and society. So with that, let me just say that as I mentioned, a decade ago, it was hard to have some of these kinds of conversations in academia, but even harder to have them in industry. When I was leaving the field of advertising and marketing, let's see, probably around 2008 or so, I'm trying to think, between 2006 and 2008, as I was kind of increasingly becoming disillusioned. The recession was starting. Everybody I knew was getting laid off. Agencies were all kind of crumbling because of the recession. And, at that time, it was, the internet was really, I think, broadly conceived by people in industry as the place where all the action would happen and where all the opportunity would happen. And when I started graduate school in 2009, I remember going to the information school at Illinois, and so many people were talking about Google in particular, like it was almost the new public library. In fact, the Google Book Digitization project was massively underway. Illinois had been one of the early universities to get involved in that project, along with Harvard and Michigan and others. And it was kind of before we started to have a bit of a turn, where academic libraries, during the time that I was in graduate school, it seemed like when I started, the people were really interested. By the time I was finishing, an eyebrow was being raised about what does it mean to start transferring so much of the public's knowledge, stores, libraries, archives, making all of this material available to a private company that might get put behind a paywall. Kind of nobody really knows how it's being used. Of course, there were really some smart computer scientists, I think, who were writing and speaking critically about the project and saying, well, you know, all of these volumes, these millions of volumes that are being digitized are actually being used to help, you know, train machine learning algorithms, right? This is actually not what you think it is necessarily. So there were these just, you know, like a peppering of critiques coming. And now I think about, as I look back at that time, as I was starting my own work, which was, you know, really largely a critique of Google as, again, as a private advertising company that was starting to encroach upon the public in a way that was really displacing other kinds of knowledge organizations and infrastructures. That it's shocking to me. We would kind of fast forward, and by 2018, the Financial Times here would declare Techlash their word of the year. I mean, the Financial Times, many of you know, is like the, you know, it's the newspaper for the 1%, let's say. It's the newspaper of capital. And so that they would start to recognize that there was an increasing kind of set of challenges around the tech industry. Now, part of this had to do with the fact that in 2018, the story of Cambridge Analytica broke. And, you know, the idea that there was this kind of wholesale manipulation and psychographic and demographic profiling of people through Facebook's platform, and of course, the incredible way that that played a role in undermining democracies around the world, kind of starting in the global South, and then really, you know, again, being perfected through Brexit and the 2016 US presidential election. You know, this really, I think, opened up a broader community of people in the world to think about what is really happening with these platforms. Even though, again, critics and scholars had been looking at this for, you know, a decade or quite frankly, more. One of the other things that I thought was interesting is that when I was entering graduate school and thinking critically about technology and of course, monopoly power and control by tech companies, there were really just, I think of it as kind of a handful of scholars, you know, a few dozen scholars that I was reading very closely, you know, Frank Pasquale, Alex Halavey, you know, Anna Everett, you know, helping us understand the early history of African Americans in Silicon Valley. I mean, there were interesting books that were coming out, but there was really, it was mostly kind of political economists, lawyers, people of color, a good solid group of women of color, and LGBTQ scholars who were really looking at the harms and trying to bring those into view. And of course, then it was those same kinds of journalists who started to pick up and amplify the harms. By the time, you know, we get to today, I mean, here we are seeing headlines all of the time, every week about AI or algorithms that might be harmful in society. And I find this, again, so incredibly energizing to know that, you know, you can kind of push a boulder of ideas up a mountain, a handful of people, and then, you know, there will be a tipping point at which those stories will start to gather momentum. And we are certainly in the throes of that, even in the face of coronavirus and COVID-19, where tech has kind of rushed in and facilitated certain types of connectivity. Certainly this remote lecture that I'm giving today and sharing of ideas with you today. But, you know, as we're kind of in this era of maybe a little blip of hype and excitement about tech making these connections, we also are dealing with kind of the underside of threats to privacy that things like contact tracing applications might pose to the public, the control over healthcare records by private industry, loss of rights and control over kind of our entire health ecosystem. So there's a lot of kinds of ways in which I think we're entering some different new normals that are going to require the kind of expertise that you all have as students. And as you know, my colleagues, in thinking about the long-term implications of what crises brings. We certainly know that the health crisis that we're in and the political crises that we're in have created huge opportunities and openings for big tech. And so if there were an industry in the United States, I can tell you, we've had between 40 and 60 million people unemployed over the course of the pandemic in the last few months, incredible losses of human life and of livelihoods. So much precarity increased in the United States and exacerbated inequality. And at the same time, it really has been the tech sector that has made an incredible amount of money and really, in my opinion, kind of profiting off of the collapse of democratic institutions and counterweights that could have otherwise helped us through some of these challenges. So we'll talk about that as we go forward. Here are some people that I want you to know about. I had mentioned that there were, I want to make sure that my screen isn't in the way, that there are people who have been at this for a long time. These are some books that I, particularly in this kind of moment of calls for racial justice in the United States, in North America, and Europe, where Black people have been kind of indiscriminate targets of state-sanctioned violence, police brutality, and it seems really appropriate in this kind of moment of a movement for Black Lives Matter for you to know about people that I think of. These are friends and colleagues that I think of as some of the most important Black thinkers about technology and the digital and society. And so these are people who, whatever your interest, I think back to Craig Watkins' early work, The Young and the Digital, where he was trying to help us understand that the way in which young African-American kids, were always kind of wholly framed as being in the digital deficit, right, as being digitally divided. When indeed, his studies helped us understand that African-American young people were in fact at the forefront of a lot of digital use, high user engagement with digital technologies, smart technologies. I always tell the joke, when I think about Craig's work, when I first came into contact with it so long ago, I remember thinking, well, that makes sense because, I'm so Gen X, and in the 80s when pagers were a really big thing. Some of you were not even born. Pagers were obsolete probably by the time you were born. But for those of us who were of the pager era, I used to laugh that the only people in my hometown who had pagers were surgeons who were on call, who had to be reached by the hospital, and the brothers in my high school. So it was like this idea of that there was this kind of bleeding edge, and that the bleeding edge is always kind of white and affluent, and well-resourced. And also it was urban African-American kids in my high school who also were on the kind of bleeding edge of video game technologies and use, pagers, and early smartphone adoption. So these are some people to take a look at. I would be remiss if I kind of didn't call out Simone Brown's amazing book, Dark Matters, which is a history of surveillance, and kind of can't think about issues of privacy, even the conception of privacy, which is very much a middle class, kind of white, idealized way of thinking about rights and integrity around personhood. And Simone Brown's book is so important because it really helps us understand that people who've been enslaved or controlled, occupied, and oppressed are people for whom the concept of privacy has never been in existence. that our lives are over determined by the gaze of others and the control of others, whether it's controlling technologies and systems, controlling public policies around things like policing, slave catching, which then became policing, all the way through to kind of state-of-the-art technologies of surveillance that we live under now. And of course, here in Los Angeles, predictive policing being one of the most critical types of surveillance that we are trying to push back on and speak to. One of our most, I think, important community-based organizations in Los Angeles, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, has really been central to help us understand the role of predictive policing as it's kind of beta tested and perfected on the most vulnerable in our community, which are people who are experiencing homelessness, people who live on Skid Row, people for whom our society has failed them in many ways. These are the communities and the people upon which predictive policing and other types of surveillance technologies are beta tested. So I just put, organizations who are doing this type of work around the world, it's so important because they're always in dialogue with scholars. And our job is to kind of, again, help policymakers in particular understand how to shift the landscape. There's other people here who I'm sure you know, Meredith Broussard and her work on artificial intelligence. If you're interested in people and kind of online culture and aesthetics, urban culture and African-American Black culture, Andre Brock's amazing work around distributed Blackness. You might know Andre, he's kind of the first person who ever did an academic study of what we know as Black Twitter many years ago. Kishana Gray, who's doing great work around woke gaming, social justice, and video games. Charlton McElwain, who's written this important book, Black Software, that counter-narrates the way we think of the great men of Silicon Valley narratives and the discourses about who the makers were of digital technologies and of software systems. And of course, my sister scholar, Ruha Benjamin, who's doing an important work around abolition and thinking about the new Jim Code. I've certainly identify with her work so much and even kind of consider myself a tech abolitionist. And I'll talk about that here in a few minutes too. All right, so this is just a quick hit for those of you who are not familiar with my work. This is kind of my earliest study that was the impetus for writing the book, Algorithms of Oppression. It's just a signal so you know kind of in the past where my work has been. It really grew from the idea of what was happening, how were people of color, women of color, girls of color in particular, vulnerable people, as I like to kind of frame in the context of Google, how were we represented and misrepresented in search engines? So from 2000, I'd say late 2009 to 2012, I was kind of regularly studying the way in which girls of color, Black girls, Asian girls, Latina girls were being misrepresented in search. And I looked, of course, beyond Google at other search engines, but one of the things that's so important is to study, of course, the monopoly leaders. When you study the monopoly leaders, you, of course, understand how most everyone else is trying to copy and replicate what the monopoly leader is trying to do. So for many years, when you did keyword searches on Black girls, Asian girls, Latina girls in, in Google search, you were kind of bombarded with these kinds of search results, which are mostly pornographic or lead to porn sites or hypersexualized sites. There's a couple in here, which is like result number 2, Black girls, free music, tour dates, photos, and then down later, third from the bottom, Black girls Facebook. That's actually a UK band of white guys who call themselves the Black Girls. It's super confusing. I always tell the joke. I mean, the joke is worn out, but it is true that these guys are excellent at search engine optimization and terrible at music distribution, because no one I've ever met, I think I'm not kidding, in a decade I've maybe met 3 people who've heard of this band. But you know, I was writing about, again, what does this mean for vulnerable communities when the prevailing logic about how something like a search engine works is that it's democracy in action, right? That this reflects what the majority of users are looking for. And of course, one of the things that's so distressing about this is that when you did these keyword searches for many years, you didn't have to add the word sex, you didn't have to add the word porn, because Black girls, Latina girls, Asian girls were just synonymous with pornography. And I wrote about this and talked about this for a long time. Finally, Google did, in fact, adjust its algorithm, and it pushed a lot of the pornography and hypersexualized content down, although sometimes it still pops back up. It then foregrounded its own partnership with Black Girls Code, and for a long time, Black Girls Code was the first hit, and that was right after Google made space for Black Girls Code in their New York offices. So, you know, this idea that Helen Niesenbaum and Lucas Introna for a long time have talked about, which is this kind of search engine bias, that search engines and platforms kind of like Google prioritize their own interests, is very true. So Google's partnerships and its own products and services, right, will always kind of get the most prominent visibility, but also the clients, quite frankly, that pay them the most are also paying for prominence. And so I've written about this for many years in different contexts. I've even written about this in the context of the US presidential election, and how these kind of same logics worked around Hillary Clinton, which is to say that the ability to optimize certain kinds of narratives about people, and especially about women, is really, really important. And, you know, since Cambridge Analytica, since that story broke in 2018, people are somewhat more aware in some quarters about the way in which Facebook and other kinds of social media, Twitter, can be grossly manipulated and flooded with disinformation and propaganda. And there have been more documentaries and more kind of, you know, writings, and lots of scholars who are studying this and kind of even triaging this on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis. I think here of like my colleague Joan Donovan at Harvard at the Shorenstein Center, watching and triaging disinformation and looking at media manipulation, all the way to like our colleagues at the Stanford Internet Observatory, Alex Demos and Renee DiResta kind of study Russian troll farms and propaganda that happens kind of online. But these issues are very serious, and of course they are a huge threat to democracy. But one of the things that I guess I just won't let go of around Google, and one of the reasons why I try to keep a lot of my focus on Google, is because what I see is that while social media and the veracity of that might be getting destabilized, people will still turn to Google search to fact check. So even if they find something that isn't quite right, or they're not sure about it in social media, they will then go and do a Google search to help them determine. And we're going to talk in a minute. I'm going to show you some ideas about why that might be indeed dangerous. You know, let me just say that, you know, the idea of Black girls being hypersexualized, it certainly is not a new narrative. It's indeed an old narrative. And I would invite you to look at the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, which is an excellent resource in understanding racist stereotypes about Black people. And of course, how this helps kind of structure the way in which certain types of programming and signals can get picked up and legitimated in something like search. So if you have an already always white supremacist society that has built incredible profit structures off of the exploitation of racist stereotypes and off of the exploitation of Black and brown people, Indigenous people, you're going to have a hard time disambiguating that from what happens in your systems. Yet, the systems are much harder to intervene upon. So when we have these kind of like long histories of racist stereotyping, let's say that happen in Hollywood, in television, in music, and radio, we understand and can intervene upon that differently. For example, we understand racist films and racist propaganda going all the way back to, the earliest film, Birth of a Nation. We understand that in a different kind of context as, let's say, unidirectional from Hollywood or from filmmakers or creators to the public. It's not iterative. We understand that there is a point of view. We understand it, and can actually organize a response to it, which is what the NAACP indeed did, organized a response, a very powerful response to Birth of a Nation when that film came out, right? And these kinds of horrible stereotypes. When it enters a space of something like a search engine, though, the public has a very different conception. One, they believe that what they find in search engines is reliable and credible. The discourse and the weight of the way in which Silicon Valley has posited both its genius, its innovation, its stability is such that it has really created a mythology that the kinds of results that come through in their products and services are the smartest. Right. And so then if you see these kinds of images, I think in these environments, that has a different kind of potency and power in confirming the truthfulness, right, or the plausibility of racist stereotypes. And one of the ways, I will just say anecdotally, I can remember in the early days sharing my work at academic conferences and hearing colleagues, older white male colleagues say things to me like, there's no way that Google's algorithm is wrong. Maybe Black girls just do more porn. And can you imagine? I mean, that to go to that type of logic, as to say that, I guess that would justify somehow the way in which Black girls are represented. And I had a daughter at the time that I was doing this. I mean, I still have a daughter, but she was young when I was doing this work. And I thought, how distressing that it's so difficult to upend the way in which people believe in the truthfulness of the kinds of things that they find in technology. So these are all the reasons why we need these kind of intersectional approaches and interdisciplinary approaches, like the kinds of things you're doing, which is combining people who really understand history and sociology and social sciences, ethnic studies, gender studies, with technologists, computer scientists, computer engineers, to then do the sense making that we need, not necessarily even to stabilize the truth that comes through in these systems, but rather to say, to make more apparent the subjectivities that are present in these systems. And I think that's one of the things that's so important in the future. All right. I wanted to share that, these same logics, as I mentioned, really apply to politics. I mean, here's a very early study. This is back in 2015. Well, this is the year before the 2016 presidential election, when a group of social scientists got together, Epstein and Robertson. They had conducted a study in 2013, and it was kind of still getting some traction, where they argued that democracy was, quite frankly, at risk because search engine results could so easily be manipulated. And what they found in their controlled study was that if candidates were represented negatively on the first page of search, that people would vote against them. And if candidates were represented positively, people would vote for them. And they argued that, search is playing an outsized role in democracy because it was so easy to manipulate what could be found and the tenor of the kinds of stories that could be placed on the first page of search. And again, this is what I mean about that people understand the subjectivities of their social networks a little bit more than they understand the subjectivities of something like search, where they just go and, again, are using it like a fact checker. So This, I think, is consistent with Matthew Hinman's work in his book, The Myth of Digital Democracy, which is another one to help us understand that those with the most capital and those with the most technical skill are really able to control what happens in platforms, including search. And I think these kinds of things are, again, starting to come much more into view than they were years ago. But these, of course, are still so powerfully at play as we're in the US just 30 days away from the next presidential election, where all of the kinds of manipulations that were happening in the 2016 election are still with us today as we enter the 2020 election. So I don't know, I feel like this is where I need to say, pray for us, y'all, pray for us. After the 2016 election, one of the things that was so amazing, you might remember these news stories, was that when you went to Google to look for final election results, the first hit in Google, this was just in days, the couple of days following the election, the first hit would take you to a disinformation site that reported out that Donald Trump had won the popular vote. Now, we know this to be patently false. We know in the US that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes and that Donald Trump had won the Electoral College. So here, though, you have to ask the question, what does it mean when the public engages and they think they're going somewhere to find the truth? And they're trying to make sense. And then the media is reporting that Donald Trump did not win, or he did win. Well, the media on television is reporting he did not win the popular vote. He won the Electoral College, but people go to Google and they see this. So these are the part of the ways in which like disinformation and propaganda is also working in the systems to destabilize democracies, to sow social discord. I mean, there's no question that these are calculated efforts that are happening both by people within the US and outside of the United States. And I think that the outsized, again, role that these systems play in kind of over determining the way politics play out is definitely important for us, not just in the US. All right, 1 second, I'm gonna get a little bit of water here, take a look at this. All right, so I talked a little bit about disinformation and propaganda, racist propaganda. Of course, I would put those kind of porn results about girls of color in the same kind of bucket of misrepresentation, right? Loss of control over identity. The question has been asked of Google many times on many different occasions. This is just one example of kind of a typical response. Here we had in Europe, this was a story that kind of went viral, where Nazis were taking over and kind of hijacking certain words like Boasian anthropology. And so it's kind of a long history of white supremacists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis. These are all very different things. They're not synonymous or interchangeable necessarily, but where they have kind of taken over certain keywords and try to optimize them. Probably most famously, we know about the way in which white supremacists had taken over the keyword Jews in Google for a very long time. Jesse Daniels wrote this amazing book called Cyber Racism, which everyone should read, really helping us understand how racism has kind of like more voice. Racist speech has more voice online than anti-racist speech. And one of the things that this kind of emblematic of that is that when Sergey Brin, in this case, was asked, the co-founder of Google, asked about this, like, how is it that these terms can be taken over? In the case of the word Jews, for many, many years, if you did a keyword search, the word Jews would take you to a whole first page of Holocaust denial sites, anti-Semitic sites. It was very difficult. Even the Anti-Defamation League got involved and wrote a letter to Google and said, what is happening here? And Jessie writes and talks about this in her work. And I think it's very important for us to understand that the typical response then Either is to put kind of a yellow box disclaimer, which is to say like, oh, some results are happening that should not be happening. And also, you should search on the words Jewish people. So again, this kind of posture of pushing it back on the user and saying like, oh, it's user error. You didn't use the right words. And I always find this to be fascinating. Here, when Bryn is asked about it, he says that to manipulate or to affect the search results in any way would be bad technology practice. So he's completely disavowing that there's anything happening other than algorithmic kind of determination, and that those things are what they are. And that is just, again, what he's saying underneath it is it's just math. Right? It's just math. It's just the way the algorithm works. This is organic. It's real. It's unaffected by humans. All right. Which of course we can all unpack. I know everyone in this lecture can unpack that algorithms are written by people and that they're full of subjectivities. So we won't spend any time on that. Except this flies in the face of what we also know is happening. And we know this because, thank goodness, of the work of scholars like my colleague Sarah Roberts, Mary Gray, who's at Microsoft Research, or her recent book, Ghostwork, journalists who've amplified their work, which have helped us understand that, in fact, in the places where Google does business, and Twitter and Facebook and eBay and Amazon, that there are certain kinds of things that are illegal in other countries outside of the US. So hate speech, for example, anti-Semitism is illegal in many parts of Europe. And Google actively employs, as does YouTube, or its subsidiaries, and many other platforms, are legions of content moderators who are actively taking down content that is not in compliance with the law or the norms or the customs of the places where these companies do business. So we have, on one hand, kind of out of one side, that to affect the algorithms or the output is bad technology practice. On the other side, in other countries, especially, but also in the US, we have, thousands and thousands of people who are actively working on managing content in platforms. And of course, this is upwards. I know in the case of Facebook, they think of content moderation as more than a $2 billion risk management issue that they have to kind of contend with. So these issues are gaining in prominence. I guess as I kind of start to wrap here and close, I'll just say that, we are so oriented to thinking about technology and techno-solutionism as a way to cut in on social problems and things like social inequality. And one of the kind of, one of my favorite excerpts of the book that Wired published was this kind of excerpt toward the end of the book where I talk about social inequality not being solved by an app. We won't lay in bed staring at smartphones, firing off likes and emails to solve social inequality. And I think these are some of the things that are so important for us to keep in mind. And this is why always centering people over the technology is so important. Always critically thinking about kind of power as it is embedded in these systems, right? And these systems as sources of power. It is so incredibly important. And so these are just things I think that are worth thinking about in your own work. Lately, I have been writing, this is kind of in my second act here, those are kind of things I've been thinking about. Currently, I'm thinking about, and I just wrote a piece a few weeks ago for Noema magazine about the loss of public goods to big tech. And I really could have named that the loss of public goods and privacy to big tech. And so I kind of put this up here for you because I want you to know that one of the things that I kind of argue in this piece is that the challenges that we are facing now have to do with the way in which big tech broadly as a category of, as an industry, let's say, has really done so much to undermine the civil rights, human rights, democracy, but also kind of the foundation that we need for the kind of large scale organization of society. So, in this case, kind of during this moment of COVID-19, I was looking at how could it be, especially here in California, kind of the birthplace to Silicon Valley and Silicon Beach, how could it be that we have a crumbling public education infrastructure, a crumbling public health infrastructure? Higher education is completely under threat. I mean, I'm a public university, university professor at UCLA, and our systems, our higher education systems, are so vulnerable right now due to COVID-19, and yet the Valley is making money kind of hand over fist. And so, asking the question, what does it mean when these companies, for example, don't pay taxes back into the public good? Those taxes that are so crucial for holding up and buttressing our social systems. And of course, in Canada, you have a really different model than we have in the United States. And so these, the way in which education, healthcare, media, all have been privatized after 40, 50 years of neoliberal social and economic policy, rollbacks of civil rights. We are in crisis in the US around kind of our fundamental democratic institutions and the resources that they need, and the way in which big tech has really been able to skim off the top, not only with the best students, the brightest students, and bringing kind of those folks into their employee ranks, but also in not giving back and in cherry picking, quite frankly, the researchers that they're interested in supporting, right? And so kind of backing their own academic industrial complex at the expense of the broader kind of institutions. For the future, this is kind of the work that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking in the realm of paradigms. What was it about the era of big cotton that was predicated upon the transatlantic slave trade, predicated upon the enslavement of African people, predicated upon the occupation of indigenous lands in North America and South America, in particular North America? I'm thinking about how did we shift the paradigm? And of course, it was a handful of abolitionists and people who were really able to find important leverage points and contradictions and point out those contradictions. The same in the era of big tobacco. When I talk to my students and I say to them, probably when I was born, the doctor had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth when he gave birth to me. I mean, there's no doubt. My mom probably smoked a pack of cigarettes like right after she gave birth in the hospital, in her hospital bed. My students find this so hard to believe, but all of us from Gen X, we know all about this. So I'm thinking about what is it, what happened? How did researchers and activists and policymakers create the shift around big tobacco? And of course, thinking about what those paradigms mean in the context of big tech. So that's kind of some of the work that I'm thinking about for the future. And I'll just close it here and say, one of the things we have is more data and technology than ever, but we also have more social, political, and economic inequality and injustice to go with this. We thought, some people thought that the data and the tech was going to equalize, was going to bring about stronger democracy, stronger social fabric and participation. And indeed, we can argue that data and technology are actually also implicated in deepening inequalities around the world. And so maybe I'll leave it there and just say thank you so much for giving me a moment to share my work with you.
Let's thank Safiya. Most people can't clap that. Okay, so if you'd like to ask questions, you can either put them in the Q&A panel or raise your hand in the participants panel.
All right.
So I see there's already a question from Rena in the Q&A. If Rena, would you like to speak if I just unmute you?
Thank you very much for the great talk. So I had a couple of questions that I put in the Q&A. So my first question was really, how do you kind of perpetuate your work forward? And especially because I know there's a lot of discourse on how we can get allies to use privilege to support minority groups. And I wanted to kind of ask about in this COVID era where, you know, attending large social gatherings and protests are no longer really an option for a lot of people. How do people sort of support movements that we see that are gaining power right now, like Black Lives Matter? And my second question was, how in the world did you not, lose your temper, to say it nicely, with all of these people in a professional environment that tell you, oh, it's Google's algorithm, it's just math, and how do you deal with that, like, blunt, like, ignorance?
Those are great questions. Okay, Rena. So I think that, of course, using the privilege is really important, and people are doing that. I mean, we're seeing that people are stepping back. They're passing the microphone to others.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Oh, no. Can you hear me? Okay, tell me if you can hear me. Can you all hear me? You can hear me. Okay. So I think, this idea of kind of passing the microphone, sharing space, opening up a dialogue, reading, all the things that people are doing in this moment of Black Lives Matter and kind of giving more space and voice to Black, Indigenous, people of color is really important. I think the most powerful ways that allies can show up is to dismantle the problems emanating from their communities too. So, rather than kind of necessarily just amplifying the voices of people of color, what does anti-racist work look like in your own community? How can you show up and affect local policy in particular? So many of the places where we're finding the rubber meets the road, like predictive policing, facial recognition, systems of surveillance, policies that really are so invasive of our privacy in education, in health, and so many different facets of our society. Many of those decisions are made locally by local city councils, local police forces, mayors, school boards, university regents, right? So we have to actually mobilize and activate at the local level as much as we have to participate in kind of national political action too. And I think that those are places that are really important. It's like Angela Davis says, freedom isn't free, right? And freedom is a constant struggle. So I think we can't take for granted that these systems won't just be wholesale adopted, and we've got to resist them everywhere we go. And that is really important work. Voting and participating, going to these meetings, speaking, mobilizing people, giving money, all the things. I'll just say, listen, anybody who wants to do work that's challenging power systems is going to hear a lot of nonsense in response to that. And so, you hear it and you know that it's what it is. I mean, I can say that, I've never been a person to necessarily like be, I don't know, your own identity sometimes can be a source of strength. So I find it much more satisfying to just trash talk that this happened than to be devastated by it. There are moments that do devastate me for sure in my career and in my work. And I think that when those things happen, it's really important. I have a very, very strong community of friends who are also scholars, who are academics, who when I tell them what happened, they really, really get it, which is different than like telling my sister who's like, I don't know what we're talking about. So I think that it's really important to have a powerful community of best friends who know your work, understand your work, that you can talk to and be supported in. That's for all of us. Okay, let's see.
Grace, you're next.
Straight.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what can we do to support you in your work right now?
Well, you're supporting, giving me a chance to share my work, amplifying the work, not just my work, but of course, I'm trying to share other people's work too. those things are really important. If you're on Twitter, I mean, I think that's a place where we all try to amplify each other's work. I mean, Twitter is what it is. You know, it's not the best, but it is a place where we can all kind of amplify and share and expand the influence of the kind of work that we're all doing here with this class. That's supportive. I mean, working on these issues so that it's no longer just a handful of people, but that kind of we turn the tide. So getting your own bona fides, you know, strengthening your own chops, that is really supportive. And then doing your work where you are in your community. I think those are things. And then we all link up and we link arms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kim, you're next.
Hi, Safiya. This was just such an amazing talk. You have no idea. I was just taking in everything that you say because I was also a UX researcher at, you know, at some of the Silicon Valley companies as well as here in Canada, and I completely identified with everything you said, as well as being a Black woman. And part of the reason I came back to do my PhD was really as a lead designer, I was privy to so much bias being baked into software. And I really didn't have a voice for it. And I ended up writing a book on sustainability and UX because I was so frustrated at all the waste as well too. But I came back to do my PhD because of everything you've talked about, this sort of computational, rhetorical bias that's built in right under our noses. And we really don't notice it until, you know, it's harmed us in some way. So my question, which I posed in the box, I had to go on mute because I'm cooking too, was aside from your book, what other books would you recommend as my B list for my primary exams in the spring?
Oh, that's so great. Well, congratulations on coming back to school and doing this work. It's so great. I know I can say I went back to school in my late 30s. I got my PhD when I was 41. So you guys know I'm old as hell. And I think that every age is the right age to go back to school. So I think that in your work, you should definitely read. Okay, so some of this is reading for what it is, and some of this is for reading what it isn't. I think that Charlton McElwain's book, Black Software, could be very valuable just to really understand history. I think that's important. I think that I'm looking at my bookcase right now. I think that Shoshana Zuboff's new book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Okay.
I have that.
Okay. So I would read that also for what's missing, like read into it for like, how is this specific to Black people? How is this specific to Indigenous people? How is this specific, right? Because those kinds of books sometimes are universal, like about people and society. And of course, that's people in society are not just homogenous. So it's really important. So that's a book to read, kind of like read it like this with it. I think her work is really important. I like, gosh, now I'm just trying to think of people that I really think. There's a list on our UCLA website on the resource page. Let me see if I can drop into the chat. I don't know if the chat is disabled or not, but I'll put it here. It's c2i2.ucla.edu. So C, the number 2, the letter I, the number 2.ucla.edu. We have a resources page there, and I curated a list of like readings that I think are really important at the intersection of race and technology that, and then you can kind of get a good smattering of different things there.
Yeah, thank you. The chat is disabled, but that's fine. I'll find it. I'll hunt it down.
Okay.
I'm very interested. You're talking about, you know, reading a splattering of everything as well too. So I really enjoy sort of having a horizontal view of all of the types of biases out there, and more concretely, really understanding what framework might we consider as people looking at this and saying, okay, here are different instances of it. How might we begin to proactively assess it and feed back into the system? So that is the space that really interests me.
It's great. I'm so glad you're doing that work. And I just encourage all of us who are who care deeply about these things. All of you will see so many more things than I could have seen when I was at this phase of my career, the phase that you're in. And your analysis will be so much better, for the work that's happened before and then the places that you'll take it. So I'm really energized. I hope anyone here, I just invite you, you're welcome to share your work with me. I'll do my best to read it, as soon as I can, and just, always interested in your publications.
Thank
Okay, we
you.
have time for one more question. We're running out of time. It'll be
Okay.
Amy.
Hello.
Hi, Amy.
Oh, hi. Did hear me? Okay, got a bit of crosstalk there. I'm delighted to be here. Dr. Noble, your book just showed up on my porch again, not because Amazon delivered it, but because a socially distanced grad student returned it to me, and that's kind of it's been making the circuit off my porch and back onto my porch and off my porch and back on. But my question for you is about balancing an awareness of how structurally these platforms and search tools and big tech disempower and stereotype and segment and surveillance capital and all the rest of it. At the same time, as we know, like through Andre Brock's work and others, that these social media platforms and search tools have allowed for a kind of flourishing of really effective identity politics, like the collection of groups of people into collectives that can act in ways that were never possible in the era of sort of gate-kept media. So how can we balance both of those awarenesses in our work?
It's so great. I mean, there's no doubt that, I was sharing Black Twitter last night before I went to bed on a text thread with some of my best friends, and then woke up to doing the same nonsense this morning. So there's no doubt that there's a lot of really rich, aesthetically incredible sharing and community building and fun and joy, and which is one of the things I love. Andre always says that I'm the pessimist and he's the optimist, and I don't know that I'm the pessimist. I just think that I think we need to do this kind of culture building, sharing, community building work, identity making work, and we need to know the limits of where we need to stop doing some dimensions of the organizing and the work and take it offline.
Yeah.
And that's really important because, it's fun to have fun and kiki, and I'm into that. But also, you kind of can't do that in the full view of like a modern COINTELPRO, right? Counterintelligence program of the US government. That these systems of surveillance are real, they're serious. If you use them the wrong way, you can be targeted by the government or law enforcement. So I think that, those things are frightening. And I also think that as young people are engaging with these systems, we have yet to see the first generation. We will see soon the first generation of young people kind of using these systems and coming of age in these systems and sharing every random thought, who try to run for Senate or try to run for Congress or try to become a social worker or try to become a teacher, and whether those things will come back to really harm them and block their ability. And of course, when you look at Silicon Valley and the way that they don't let their own children participate in these technologies, that tells you a lot. So I think we have to just really try to have the widest scope and the biggest picture so that we can be responsible in the way that we're working in these systems and around them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
You all are so fun. Thank you. Thank you.
Time.
Ian,
Thanks,
so much.
Sophia. Yay.
So awesome. You guys are great.
Okay, and so if this talk interested you, stay tuned for future talks in the CrySP speaker series on privacy. Our next talk is Friday, October 30th. It's Rihanna Pfefferkorn from the Stanford Center for Internet and Society. So be sure to join us for that. And I'm glad Safiya was able to join us, even albeit in this online format.
You too.
Okay, thank you all for coming.